You're listening to The Map of Us, a companion podcast to the LGBTQ Media Mapping Project. I'm your host, Dana Piccoli, Managing Director of News Is Out, a pioneering queer media collaborative. Today's episode looks at who holds the mic in queer journalism and who gets to shape the stories we read. The Mapping Project showed that most LGBTQ outlets are still owned or led by white, cisgender gay men, even though the community and its audiences are far more diverse. Outlets run by women, people of color, trans and non-binary leaders often face steeper funding barriers, smaller advertiser interest, and assumptions about who their coverage is for. At the same time, many of these publishers are building national platforms and expanding the definition of queer media itself. To talk about what it means to diversify leadership and create space for more marginalized voices, we're turning things over to Jake Wittich of Windy City Times. Jake is joined by media leaders Anna DeShawn of E3 Radio, Tamara Leigh of Blaqueout, and Joseph Jafaari of Lookout. Together, they explore how ownership shapes coverage, what barriers still exist, and what it will take for queer media to reflect the full diversity of our communities.
Hi, everyone. I am Jake Wittich. My pronouns are he, him, and I am managing editor of Windy City Times, which is Chicago's legacy LGBTQ news outlet of 40 years. In this episode, I'll be sharing a series of conversations with queer media leaders who are expanding and diversifying who gets to lead in our field. Up first is Tamara Leigh, founder of Blaqueout magazine. Tamara launched Blaqueout in 2020 to build space where Black and brown queer voices could lead the storytelling. Today, it has become a vital hub not only for information and culture, but for connection and community support. Tamara, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited.
Yeah, it's really awesome to have you here. As I said before this call, I'm just such a nerd about queer media. So to be talking to you and other leaders is really exciting today. But before we dive into the broader themes of leadership and representation, I want to start with your story and the roots of Blaqueout. So for listeners who may not be familiar with your work, can you briefly tell us a little bit about Blaqueout and what inspired its creation?
Absolutely. So I was living in upstate New York, and I was hired to be the communication director for a LGBTQ resource center, an organization. And part of that job was to be the editor of what at the time was the longest continuously published LGBTQ periodical in the nation. It was called the Empty Closet. And so that was a headfirst crash course in publishing and design. And also feeding an audience, which I was a part of, but it's a different thing to create that media than just to consume it. And so it was a team effort, but it was a pretty much one-man show. I mean, if you ever worked in nonprofit world, you know that you are required to be a jack of many trades. So I was figuring it out as we went along. And when I came into the space, I realized that the organization, as well as the magazine, it was born out of Stonewall. It was folks that sort of had the economic ability to move upstate and into Rochester, New York. And it was probably the most liberal and LGBTQ friendly of all of the upstate New York cities. And so, it was this tremendous legacy publication and organization, but it never made the turn. It never made that turn towards diversity, towards equity, towards really being representative of the entire community. It was sort of an old white man organization and magazine, and that just wasn't who we were as a community, and we needed to be. So then the organization, the magazine just never made the turn. They never really learned how to or put the resources, their efforts into being representative of the entire community, which was incredibly important, especially as we were approaching 2020, which was like this explosion of the world and this country realizing how important it was to have all the voices at the table and what representation looked like. And that was like the 2 years leading up to me taking this job and me starting in this work. And so we started making those changes with the magazine, and people hated it. They were angry. I got nasty, death threats and nasty emails and people who would just come straight up to me and be like, this is not it. Like, what are you doing? You're ruining this thing that we love. And we pressed forward. So I got my bones in that role and really learned what that looked like and how hard it was, but the things that worked and the things that didn't work. And so we were in New York during COVID, where the world shut down like nobody's business, like nobody else did in the rest of the country. And so the agency ended up shuttering. And so I was left like, what do we do now? And I spent most of that year in the street protesting, became sort of the queer voice in the Black Lives Matters movement then, because although it was very pro Black community, they still had not figured out how to make those same diversity changes in a movement to make sure that they were including intersectional Black and brown voices in the movement. And so I kind of became that voice there. And so I spent these 2 incredibly formative years really navigating through all of those waters. And when things started to calm down a bit towards the end of 2020, and I had to kind of decide where my life was going and what was next for me, people kept asking me, well, why don't you start your own magazine? Because at the time when the agency shuttered, so did the publication. And I was like, that's impossible. Like, I don't have a major machine behind me to do all these things and all this money and budget and people and designers and whatever. And then the longer that we talked about it, the more I realized sometimes you come up with the thing and then figure out how to make it work. And so we came up with the thing and we figured out how to make it work. And we've been kind of figuring out how to make it work for the last 6 years. And now we are about 65 issues in. We publish every month. We have international readers and we have writers from all over the country that are really just telling their stories and helping us to get news and information out to people and in ways and from communities that are really not heard from in many other arenas, which is amazing.
How big is every issue?
So we average around 45 pages, right? Which is big. It's a lot of work. I am the graphic designer and also the editor. Thankfully, I have an amazing team of folks that chip in and help me work through editing and that process. But it's a undertaking and it's monthly, which is often. And so, it's a good size publication. But we cover everything from like news and all the insane things that are happening in our country right now to just telling great stories about culture and who people are and what people are experiencing and the great things that are happening. Like, we have to balance this dystopian nightmare with the great things that are happening. And so it takes, 45, 50 pages to do that every month.
Yeah. One thing that Blaqueout has spearheaded is a framework called the Trans Remembrance Archive and Information Index. Can you tell me more about this resource and why it was created?
Absolutely. So it's really incredible. I wish more people knew about it. I wish more people utilized it. I worked with an organization that works with youth, again, in Rochester, New York, where I'm from, that they have found a way to use geospatial technology, which is basically what your GPS uses, to be able to plot all of the incidences of violence that have led to the deaths of trans and non-binary and non-conforming folks around the country since the information has been being gathered in 2018. And you can go into this very free resource that lives on our website and pick different factors: age, manner of death, location, geography, and really search each one of these stories. It leads you to an index which gives you like news reports and information about conviction. And the reason why this felt so important is, we do a TDOR. I've been doing TDOR recognition events. Right. Trans Day Remember. Yes. For almost a decade now. And although it is always incredibly important and incredibly powerful, we wanted to do something that could keep making that list smaller, hopefully. We read the names, and every year it just breaks your heart to see all these very, very young people. I recently heard a statistic that the average age lifespan for a Black trans woman went from what I think was like 35 to like 23, or some ridiculously horrendous number. So these statistics, although they are hard to see and hear and read, they are incredibly important for people to understand what an epidemic this is. And so we just wanted to give people another outlet, especially since federally, they used to collect this information. Organizationally, the big LGBTQ organizations used to collect and publish this information. They don't anymore. And so our website is one of the few places that you find this information. So one, it is to remember people. People shouldn't exist and be a part of this world and then just poof, disappear, and then their names disappear with them and we never hear about them again. We want people to remember. We want people to be able to look up their friends and family and loved ones and know that someone's paying attention and that they still exist in some form somewhere. But also, we want people's organizations to be able to have this information when they're fighting for funding. We want them to be able to, media organizations, to be able to go on here and look and see these numbers and have information and facts that they don't have to search hard to find. It's right there in front of them. So they have absolutely no reason not to publish these stories or talk about these people because it's all laid out right in front of you. And also, there are clusters where these murders happen. They're everywhere in the country. They're in blue states and red states, but they're also clusters. And so we want people to know when they're traveling, when they are in different areas, when they're working, when they're living their lives, maybe where they need to be a little bit more vigilant and paying attention to the fact that, there could be people who are literally preying on our trans community in certain areas. And it's a lot easier to see that when it's plotted in places over years to see where these things are taking place.
So this episode, we really want to examine who gets to lead queer journalism. And you mentioned earlier that Blaqueout is unique in having every person involved be Black or brown, queer or trans. How do you think this approach to staffing opens the doors for more diverse voices to shape queer journalism?
Well, I'm hoping it does. The thing about it is, last lifetime, last chapter of my life, I was a PR person before I stepped into the role at the LGBTQ Center. And, I was doing work that was important. It helped small businesses grow. It helped people learn about the things they were doing. But I would have never gotten hired at a large PR firm. I didn't have the look. I didn't have the pedigree. I didn't have the connections. I would have never gotten in those doors. And so the work that I was doing was important. I was helping people, but I would never been able to do it if I didn't pass that on my own to do that work. And I feel very similarly about media. There are people who are incredibly talented, who are incredibly knowledgeable. And there's some that I used to work with who used to always say that we are the experts of our own experience. And I think the experiential piece of it is so much more important. And so you don't understand the importance of the story. You don't get the humanity of the story. And you often don't even hear the story if you're not talking to or a part of the communities that you're talking about. You can go into a space and report on something. You will miss so many pieces if you aren't amongst that community, if you aren't trusted in that community, if you aren't leading and experiencing the same thing that the people in that community are. I can go in and tell a story about anything. However, there'll be so many nuances that I will miss because it's just not my experience. And so being able to put, people hate social media, but I love it because it made us all reporters. It made us all writers. It made us all reporters. It made us all witnesses to experience that the larger media machine would have missed. And so my hope is, one, by empowering people to find their voices through the magazine, it's huge. Whether they continue to do it for Blaqueout or they do it out in the world after they've experienced Blaqueout, that's all wonderful things. But just also being able to elevate people to a platform where they're really being heard. So many of us feel silent, especially right now with the things that are happening. So many of us feel powerless. So many of us don't see ourselves in leadership or in creative positions or in the media. And so to be able to know that someone looks like you and lives like you and loves like you and experiences the things that you experience, at least on some scale, I think it's tremendously important for not just us, but the people who are still yet to find those voices who can see themselves in you and have something to strive for.
Yeah, it's a great approach you're taking there. And then to tie things up, independent BIPOC-led outlets often face unique sustainability challenges. I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit about what keeps Blaqueout going and what kinds of support would make the biggest difference for your publication.
Grit, blood, sweat, and tears, and duct tape, usually. It's tough. What I don't think everybody understands, beyond the media machine that is all powerful and very exclusive, most magazines, especially, but newspapers also, are owned by these giant conglomerates. People don't realize this magazine that is a smaller publication or niche for specific communities may still be owned by the same people that own People magazine. And so there's a huge machine behind you. That's resources, that's money, that's advertising. They don't necessarily have to specifically personally go out and court advertisers, which for the most part is what sustains publications is advertising. And so that is already that machine already exists for them and it kind of filters down to them as completely independent media. the buck stops with me. And so that's me personally trudging out there, talking to people, explaining what we do, explaining who we are, trying to get advertising to sustain us, trying to get grants to pay our writers to make sure that they're being rewarded for the work that they're doing. And they don't always come in. And now with the challenges on a federal level in terms of funding, anything that even looks like it has anything to do with diversity or equity or inclusion is losing all its funding. So even if we were getting even organizations that may think to advertise with us may not be able to do that because of who we are and what we do, or may have lost all their funding, their critical funding for services they provide. So advertising is like a luxury at that point, and so that kills our funding. So financially is the hard part. So getting the magazine in people's hands, getting word out there, really working the channels that we can in terms of social media, outlets that may not cost us as much to be able to just really push out the content and advertising so people know that we exist. Also, where do advertisers advertise? We can't go to a newspaper or a magazine to advertise because it is effectively competition. Getting the word out is tough. Holding on to the funding is tough. Getting people to subscribe. People don't like to read the way that they once did. We are a very, for 3 seconds, I believe, to catch people's attention and, clickbait stories. And we don't sensationalize. We don't want to sell you garbage in order for you to lock in. We want to give you quality stories and important information. And that's not always as flashy. If you have to know you want to learn something to tune into us. And so we've had the opportunity to have some awesome celebrities on our covers, which certainly helps. So we can tell their stories and their origin stories a bit. Getting the readers is tough. Getting people to read not just the stuff we put out online, but actually subscribe because that sustains us is tough and important. But also just making sure that we keep the continuous funding coming in, which is a full-time job on top of the full-time job that we're already doing.
Well, thank you so much, Tamara. That was amazing. That is all the time we have for now, but I really appreciate you sharing your insights and the work you've been doing to expand representation in queer media. For any listeners who want to plug into Blaqueout's work, visit www.blaqueout.com. That is BLAQUEOUT.com. Stay with us. I'll be right back with another queer media leader for our next conversation. Next, I am joined by Joseph Jafaari, founder and editor-in-chief of Lookout. Lookout is a unique in the LGBTQ plus media landscape as an independent investigative newsroom focused on accountability, power, and impact. Joseph, thanks so much for being here today. How are you?
Doing well. Thank you so much for having me today.
Yeah, very excited to talk to you. We've been talking to other queer media leaders as well. But to first ground listeners in your work, I want to start with how Lookout came to be and what was the vision behind it.
So Lookout came to be, we are actually hitting our 3-year mark next week, December 22nd of 2022, because I think to kind of give a bit of background. So my entire history has been as an investigative reporter covering military, covering police, covering prisons. And every once in a while when I felt really into it, kind of covering the intersection between police and military and queer communities, but it wasn't really that often. It was just kind of like a side project when I needed extra money as a reporter. But then when I got recruited out to Arizona for the Arizona Republic, it was during the time period, it was again 2021, 2022, when we started seeing this in mass number of anti-LGBTQ bills really proposed at state government. And the coverage I was seeing from our paper of record was really kind of reactionary. And at one point, we had more op-eds about pronouns than we actually had stories about the bills coming out that were addressing pronouns. I remember bringing it up to my editor, and my direct editor kind of said, I think you should bring it up to the editor in chief, the executive editor. And I kind of did. And I was kind of poo pooed and said this wasn't a big deal, that this community wasn't something that we were going to really focus on, and that the issues that we were covering at the Arizona Republic were just fine. We didn't need to go any deeper. And I thought that was kind of leaving a lot of I thought that was leaving money on the table, for one, for an organization that was really kind of like scavenging for money at that point. But then on top of it, it kind of felt like, we're 250,000 strong in Arizona as far as most recent numbers go. And I thought that was just kind of like poo-pooing a number of people that could easily fill, any kind of city in Arizona. So kind of did some pushback. continued to kind of like push for it and didn't get anywhere. And so I protested and I started a Substack and kind of just said, well, if you're not gonna cover this, then I'm gonna cover it. It's gonna be a once a month type of thing. And then our first story scooped everybody. It was about this couple in Queen Creek that were being terrorized by their neighbors for putting up the pride flag. And then everybody picked it up after that. And then kind of slowly realizing my editor kind of knew I was doing this on the side because I was using a pen name at the time. And we got a grant later on to kind of turn it into something real because it was something that I think a lot of people recognized was dire and needed.
Yeah, totally. It's funny how that happens. I've experienced that too, where I've been in jobs in this industry where it felt like getting these stories approved was an uphill battle. Now I'm at Windy City Times, and the second we do a story, everyone's doing it. And I'm like, funny.
Right, right. We
Yeah.
experienced that even this week where we published a story about something that even really isn't necessarily queer, but queer adjacent. And that's very much like how we approach our stories about how people are trying to deny medical care in parks here. We were the first to report on it, and now everybody's reporting on it because they picked up our stories. So it's funny how when you kind of like embed yourself in the right communities and kind of like build trust in those areas, you're able to kind of scoop other outlets that arguably are not looking in those places.
Yeah, yeah. Well, talking more about Lookout, one thing that's unique about it is its focus on investigative news. Why was it important to build a queer outlet centered on accountability and investigative reporting?
Yeah. So, I mean, accountability journalism essentially is, it's essential in any democracy, but LGBTQ communities often face like systematic erasure, they face discrimination, targeted policy, and attacks that mainstream outlets often overlook. And, so our approach to journalism is we've kind of like backing away from the investigative word because we're not as much as we would like to be. We're not a Marshall Project. We're not a ProPublica in the sense of we're not spending like 6 months to a year on one story. And my only reporter is not spending just like that only time doing that. So we really have been focusing more on the accountability aspects and really hammering that. But this approach also challenges the notion that queer media should really only focus on like celebration or identity. It can and really should be a watchdog. And so, we've been really focusing on that as kind of like the reason of our being because nobody else is really doing it. Even when there were queer outlets here in Arizona, nobody was really diving into records requests. I take my job as a reporter, especially an investigative reporter, fairly seriously, which is that, I believe in the old adage of journalism that we are a fourth estate and that we are meant to continually do checks and balances on our governments, finance it, who's in power, what that power is doing. And the only way to do that is through accountability journalism. There's room for other journalism, 100%, but the type of resources that go into accountability work is vast. It takes a lot of time. It takes money. It takes dedicated resources. Like, yeah, you're going to have $1,000 budget to spend on records. A lot of news outlets don't do that, especially a lot of queer outlets don't do that, but we dedicate that money to that.
Now, this episode we're talking for examines who really gets to lead in queer journalism. From your perspective, how does leadership shape which institutions are scrutinized and which stories receive the time and resources to be reported?
So the way that I look at kind of is from top down, I think of like when I've worked at other news outlets where there are queer people in charge, right? Versus kind of like the news outlet that kind of we work at, which is queer focused and kind of like how we kind of look at things. And I often feel like even just because somebody is queer and at the helm of a news outlet, it doesn't necessarily mean that there is a cultural change in the news outlet. We're still talking about legacy forms of journalism. We're talking about people who maybe kind of live and die by the pen and don't really make room, even if it is their communities, to kind of make room for, dare I say, a more, active kind of like journalism. And I don't mean activists. I mean more just like there's no getting around the fact that journalism is activism, right? I'll just say that off the bat. I mean, we crisscross around the country saying we're not activism journalism. I do feel that's different. But we do inherently, as journalists, and especially as accountability journalists, we say what is right and what is wrong. Being at the helm of a queer outlet and being queer myself, I oftentimes think of just like what stories are not being told and kind of how we can pigeonhole ourselves in. So I think the only way I kind of like say is for an example when there are stories about juvenile justice, right? Oftentimes people look at like the effects of juvenile justice on long-term effects when it comes to, mental health or when it comes to ability to get jobs later on in life. We kind of take it and go, cool, how can we look at juvenile justice issues through a queer lens, which is, people who are impacted in juvenile justice systems and then are queer, but then what are their lives like compared to those on the outside? So we may take a bit more of a micro approach to a macro issue, because it deserves just as much scrutiny as the macro issue. That's kind of how we look at it.
Of course, yeah. And you are a queer person of color. You told me you are Middle Eastern. How does that identity or lived experience inform the perspectives that you bring in to Lookout or the kinds of stories you do?
From my perspective, it's interesting, right? Because as a Middle Eastern person working in news, period, it's been a wild, 15, 20 years. 15 years I've been in the industry, but 20 years since I've been like, really actively engaged in news, right? And so coming at it from the perspective of it's interesting to kind of be someone who's trying to push the bounds of like what is, whose voices are we included in stories, how we're making sure to be not just, quote, objective, but really how we're trying to be fair on stories. That's one thing, right? I grew up with the news saying that Middle Eastern people were all, enemies, right? We all grew up on like the New York Times op-ed pages that kind of like really scrutinized Middle Eastern identities, and now we're doing the same thing with trans identities, right? And we're kind of even seeing a resurgence of it with Middle Eastern identities now. But more specifically, the kind of the way that we like, the way that I at least, attack journalism through this lens, is it's allowed me at least to kind of ask like the extra question of what voice aren't we gathering on this? What nuance aren't we finding in this? It's maybe one thing, like we're a border state, obviously, Arizona. So we could easily be covering just trans, queer, like Latino migrants. But like we also have a lot of people who are being deported in Arizona who are not just Latino, right? We have a large Iranian population that has just got deported. When I get a story like that, at least for me, I look at it and go, cool. Are we being too focused? Are we not being broad enough? Are we not being, like expanding our horizons a bit to kind of like think outside the box a bit? So that's kind of the way that I think of it.
Yeah, totally. And then independent outlets in general, queer outlets face real sustainability pressures. What has it taken to keep Lookout independent, and what kinds of support are most critical to keep this work going and going well?
Essentially, I think I'm a bit of an outlier where there is an argument that foundations need to step up, need to put their money where their mouth is. We saw during George Floyd foundations like say, "Oh, we really care about Black media. We really care about media that's serving immigrant communities," and they kind of like stepped up, but then they stepped out when it got really uncomfortable. We're not seeing the same thing towards queer media right now in the same kind of way. I mean, there's only so many nonprofit queer media outlets, and I know that that's just a reality. But on top of it, when you're looking at like just funding of queer issues, just generally, like can't remember the exact number, but like it was a study that came out last year that said like we get like 0.2% of all funding, right? That's just wild. That includes HIV and AIDS funding from philanthropy. So there needs to be step up from foundations. When if the people care about democracy, then they care about news. If they care about health, then they care about news. If they care about education, then they care about news. At the end of the day, people care about information. And these foundations that say they care about these things, they need to step up to the plate. But on top of that, because we are a nonprofit, I have a very, very strong belief that nobody should have to pay to be informed within their communities. Nobody should have to put a dime down to know that, the city council is voting against your right to exist or something like that. Right. So we don't put anything behind the paywalls. Unfortunately, it also requires that people who read the news understand the value that it takes to do that news. Like I said, we will allocate $1,000 for records. People think that records just kind of fall into your lap. It takes time, it takes follow up. We pay people pretty generously above standards around here, and so people need to understand the value of the news that they're like getting in and they're getting for free. It needs to be paid for in some kind of way. So foundations need to step up, and then as much as we try to hammer our readers, like please like subscribe, pay for this news. People need to also recognize that news is not free.
Yeah, totally. Looking ahead, what gives you hope about the future of sustainability for queer media?
I think one thing that has gotten me really excited is the fact that we all are very collaborative. Um, when I was working at regular, just kind of like general massive news outlets, these editors oftentimes just didn't want to work together because they were so precious about audience, right? Because they didn't want to put down their paywall, because they didn't want to allocate their resources for 70% of a piece when the other outlet was only doing 30% of the work or something like that. In my experience, working within this field right now and kind of leading, our own kind of cohorts of queer news outlets doing certain things. Like, it's been incredible to see that this is the most collaborative, media ecosystem I've ever been a part of. Whether or not like we fully execute on everything, the drive and want to work together, because I think we recognize that our media ecosystem, specifically the queer media ecosystem, it's growing a bit, but it's not really growing in the way of of the stuff that Windy City Times does, or Buckeye Flame does, or Washington Blade. Like it's a lot of like arts and culture that is kind of blossoming right now and kind of coming up in zines, but nothing really like substantial. We kind of recognize that in order for us to succeed, we need to band together and we need to think of really new and industrious ideas to kind of get the ball moving to do better journalism for not just our community, but people who care about us.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights and for the work that you do to bring accountability and rigor to queer journalism. And for listeners who want to learn more about Lookout and support their reporting, you can visit their website at lookoutnews.org. Stay with us. We'll be right back with our final conversation with another queer media leader. Hello, and we are back with our final interview of this podcast. Throughout this episode, we have been talking with queer media leaders who are reshaping who gets to lead in our field. And to close us out, I am joined by Anna DeShawn. Anna is a Black queer journalist and media founder. She created E3 Radio to amplify Black queer voices through audio storytelling. And she also leads Blacklines, which is Windy City Times' newsletter focused on culturally relevant news and features for Black queer communities. Anna, thank you so much. How are you doing today?
Thanks for having me, Jake. I'm great.
Good, cool. So to close this episode, I want to start by grounding us a little bit in your work and the vision behind E3. So for listeners who might be new to your work, can you introduce yourself and share what led you to create E3 Radio?
Family. That's usually how people know me these days. I am somebody who's always loved media, always knew from a very young age I wanted to do television or radio, went to school for that, and pivoted because I couldn't do a small market again. So I came back home and found my way. I started by creating my own platform, like you mentioned, E3 Radio, to tell the stories that were happening here around Chicago. And what I found was that so many people I was interested in interviewing had never been interviewed before. And I thought that that was wild, considering the impact that they had had on me and my friends and the communities in which I was serving. And it just became so evidently clear that people living at the intersections of being queer, of being Black, of being brown, were being left on the margins of the storytelling that needed to be done. And so I felt like I could do that. And I've been doing it ever since.
And we're so grateful for that. So thank you for the work you do. This episode really examines who gets to lead queer journalism. From your perspective, why does leadership, especially Black queer leadership, why does that matter in shaping what stories are told and how they're told?
Because for so long, we've been left out of the narrative as it pertains to LGBTQ storytelling, news, and our perspectives are different. And I want to overemphasize this point here is that, yes, for me, it is Black queer storytelling because that is my particular social location. But let us be clear, all the intersections that all the people living at the intersections of LGBTQ, right? Plus, okay, wherever you fall on the spectrum need to be heard. And being part of the LGBTQIA plus community does not negate the racism that still exists within our community, right? And so when I look at media today, the same way I looked at media 15 years ago when I started this journey, it was white gay men. And when I look around, when I attend the galas that I get an invitation to these days, it is still white gay men. And that still has not changed. But that is not different than the America that we're living in, right? So we as a community have to take ownership of how we show up, right? And we show up the way in which we were taught how to show up. And oftentimes that means that the folks I care about the most, Black and brown folks living at the intersections of being LGBTQ, get left out. They don't get the invitations. Their stories aren't told. No one knows how to reach them. And so for me, the reason why Black queer leadership is important is because our perspectives are incredibly important. It's because whatever is happening is impacting us double or triple time of what it's impacting those who are most privileged inside of our communities. And dang it, we fun and we cute, okay? And we got a lot of good things happening that a lot of people should know about. So there's a lot of reasons why Black queer leadership is important. Our stories are important. But overall, why folks who are living at all these intersections of being queer, that doesn't equate to being a white gay man, it's important to hear from those folks.
Percent. And another project you're involved in related to this mission is Black Lines, which is Windy City Times newsletter focused on culturally relevant news and features for Black queer Chicagoans. It actually revives a publication that existed in the 90s and early 2000s serving this community. So it's really cool that we brought it back as a newsletter. Why do you think a local platform like this is so important? And what does it allow you to cover that might get overlooked?
Because Chicago is built on segregation. Like, we have to look at this from a historical perspective. When Black folks moved to Chicago, often from the South, right? The Great Migration, read the book, it's real. I've lived it. I'm a part of it. My mom is from Mississippi. Redlining was very real. Dr. King's experience in Chicago, research it, do it. I ain't gonna talk about it. It's very real what he felt about Chicago, and it was intentional. So as someone who grew up here in Chicago on the South Side, I'm very familiar with the segregation that exists in this city. And so there are people who I know who have never and will never make it to the north side of Chicago to experience a Boys Town or North Halsted, yes. And so when we are separated by geographic location, that also means that programs, services, stories, events, music, like everything is also segregated and separated. And so if I'm waiting on the mainstream LGBTQ magazine or newspaper to report on what's happening for me where I'm living, I might be waiting a very, very long time. So Black Lines and in La Vida, right, are just so incredibly important because it's reporting about the things that folks don't often see if you're not living in our areas of the city, and stories that aren't often amplified if you're not living in our areas of the city. I wish it was different, but it's not. Right. And so we're having to work within a system that was created before we had anything to do with it. And so Black Lines is just so incredibly special to be able to speak to Black queer folks in Chicago, uplift the business owners and the stories, the history. I mean, Jake, the stuff you pull for the archives, right? It's just brilliant. And I just love it. And I know when people see me and they talk about it, they be like, Anna, I bookmarked it, I flagged it so I can go back and actually read it. And that's the biggest compliment. It's that people aren't just opening it and scrolling. They really want to read it. And today, because of the decline of newspapers, manifesting this and pivoting to a newsletter to reach people, I'm so glad y'all decided to do it, because this is how we keep this journalism engine moving and showing the importance of it, because so often they don't know the stories.
Yeah. And I just want to add, this partnership between Windy City Times and E3 Radio for Black Lines has been especially meaningful. I think it's benefited both of our organizations. We really get to uplift the incredible work you're doing at E3 Radio. You are on the ground where your community is at, and now we get to signal boost that. And at the same time, you're signal boosting what we're doing at Windy City Times, which has helped us grow and reach new people. So it's a meaningful partnership. And I'm curious, there's a lot of challenges facing queer media right now. What role do you see partnerships like that in helping us navigate them?
They're critical. I don't think anybody should be doing work alone right now at all. Everybody should be collaborating. Everybody should be doubling down on their audiences to help everybody grow their audiences and expand the reach of the work. It is mission critical that we are not out here alone. We are living in dangerous times. This is not, I don't know, a bumper sticker message. No, this is flat out reality. The news that I'm reporting on every week, what I'm seeing around Chicago, the people I know that are on the front lines showing up, against ICE, who are showing up fighting, across the country, anti-trans legislation. Glad I don't have to deal with that here in Illinois, but I know folks who are around the country. I mean, this is a wild and dangerous time. History is repeating itself in some of the most dangerous, reckless times this country has ever experienced. And the great experiment that is the United States of America, let me tell you, it has failed people who look like me a lot. And right now it's failing us again. And we ought not be out here alone doing this work. Like, you can't do this alone. We all need each other in this moment, and that's community, and that comes in the form of partnerships. And I think what's so brilliant, Jake, recently, even with all the things happening here in the city with ICE, all the media orgs that partnered together to uplift and amplify each other's reporting, that's something that did not exist when it was just newspapers. That type of collaboration didn't exist at the level it can with social media. And that's how we can hone in and really leverage the power of social media for good, you know? Yeah, we just should never, ever right now. Actually, we should never do this work alone, but especially right now.
Especially. Yeah.
Yeah.
And to give a little bit of context, Anna is talking about ICE. And like many cities in America, they have invaded Chicago and been abducting our neighbors. And it's been awful. But media organizations here have really partnered together to uplift each other's incredible reporting on this horrible situation that's unfolding. They're teaming up to share video and audio that's collected by their reporters or civilians that are just observing these acts. And sharing across newsrooms. So there's been a lot of partnership to make sure that this injustice is covered fully. So that's the context there. But I'm curious, Anna, are there any other unique challenges you face either as a queer Black leader in this space or just sustainability challenges running a queer media organization right now?
Yeah. I mean, even saying those words can put you banned on any list. I was scrolling through my TikTok today and I didn't even realize they had banned so many of my videos, right? Words are being banned, hashtags are being banned. We supposedly live in a time of free speech, but child, it's a time of whatever Trump speech wants to be approved. And so the content is challenging even to create and having to do double dutch around what is being regulated because the message still needs to get out. Right. So that's been a challenge. Funding is always a challenge, trying to find the right people who want to support the work, trying to find out what sustainability looks like. How many revenue streams can we have, Jay, to make ends meet? I think the LGBTQ Mapping Project did a wonderful job around reporting the average revenue for newsrooms telling LGBTQ stories. And don't get me quoting on the data. I'm sure somebody got it right, but I believe over 50%, accounted for less than $100,000 in a year. Who can employ staff with that? How can you grow with that? You can't. You can't. And
Yeah.
so, I think fighting the federal government in this moment is a challenge. Finding funding and ways to remain fiscally sustainable is a challenge. But at the same time, it's all an opportunity too, right? So I think a lot about Nadine Smith down in Florida with Equality Florida. And when I had an opportunity to interview her, and she talked about her slingshot theory and her analogy around the slingshot being, we're getting pulled back with all these policies, anti-trans policies, anti-LGBTQ, erasing us, trying to erase folks, from public life. And they're doing all of this work. And let's be clear, it's all evil work, yes. And her theory says that once they get done with this, the slingshot gets let go and we end up further ahead than we were when they first started the mess. And that's true. I believe that. I actually believe that to be true because people only begin to move when they get uncomfortable. I think we got real comfortable during the Obama years. We began to take a lot of that for granted. We wanted to move further ahead, right? We saw progress on the forefront and it was in that moment, right, that right-wing MAGA was activated, right? That is when they got activated. And now I feel like Black and brown communities have activated. I think we could see that in the elections we just had. I think we'll see it in the primaries, that Democrats and folks who want to be independent, child, I don't care. What do you care about, right? I think folks are activated right now in ways we haven't been when we weren't uncomfortable. And so I think when we get past this moment, we probably will end up further ahead than we were before. But it's just going to be hella painful on the way there.
Of course. But I like that you're leaving us with a message of hope. I'm sure you've experienced this too at E3 Radio, but people are more engaged with LGBTQ news more than ever. So it's great. The slingshot, we're being pulled back, but we are going to accelerate forward. So thank you for ending with that optimistic note, Anna. And with that brings us to the end of our episode. So Anna, thank you so much for sharing your insights and the work that you do to make sure Black queer voices aren't just heard, but centered and sustained. For listeners who want to learn more about Anna's work, you can find E3 Radio online at E3 Radio. Again, that is e3radio.fm. And thank you everyone who's listening to The Map of Us. This episode explored who owns the mic in queer journalism and how that leadership shapes the stories we tell. I hope you enjoyed these conversations. Thank you for listening, everyone.
Before we wrap, we want to thank our partners supporting this work. The LGBTQ Media Mapping Project was funded by the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, with support from the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at City University of New York, Local Media Association, and News is Out. To learn more about the Media Mapping Project, visit newsisout.com. Special thanks to Ken Schneck of the Buckeye Flame for the use of his podcast platform, to Jake of Windy City Times, and our incredible guests for sharing their insights and experiences. And thank you for listening. We'll see you next week for the final episode of The Map of Us.